We are. Good morning to those online. Good morning to those that are here in person. And so I started off on one trajectory. So hypothetically this week I should be somewhere around in like Matthew 24, and usually what we call the Olivet Discourse. But I'm going to change what I'm doing because I needed to hit some preliminary material. So 2 weeks ago was preliminary. This is a different version of preliminary. So just get ready to kind of bear with that. Because, I recognize as I was looking at the trajectory and kind of doing an outline of what kind of was the content that was coming up, I realized that sometimes when we talk about things that usually we consider quote-unquote the end of the world, it's kind of like it can be a downer because like it scares the living bejeepers out of people. I mean, if you really want any proof, all you have to do is look at even such a great bastion as Hollywood to see all of the apocalyptic movies that are coming out that are becoming incredibly popular. It's amazing that apparently the end of the world is a great way to make large quantities of money in entertainment. But we've been doing it for a while now, so that gave me a pause. And then what gave me another pause is it's okay, but what are you supposed to actually do about it? Or what do you do in reaction to it? I don't like things like that, and I don't think that any of us really like the idea that we're just kind of like inert and like sitting there like vibrating. It's kind of an annoying feeling, if you ask me. Furthermore, as Christians, we're never called to just like exist. That's just not what we really do. So, hopelessness, nihilism, all that other mumbo-jumbo is a non-biblical response to a situation that we confront that we look at and go, what are we supposed to do about it? You basically have two responses, and especially as believers. Now, just to make sure that we connect with this well, if you have seen Lord of the Rings, this will help you. Okay? Because you have one of two responses, okay? So let me set the stage here. Now, you're in Minas Tirith, and you have been surrounded. And there's like big, creepy, oversized bat things with weird, creepy people that aren't really alive on them. It's not good, okay? That's the technical term for that. Not good. So you have one or two responses. The dude that's supposed to be in charge is called the steward, who by this time has lost his mind. And he tells everyone to run and flee for their lives, in which case Gandalf jumps out, whacks him over the head with a stick, and says, prepare to fight. You have one of two responses. You can fold, what I call the Denethor response, or you can fight, which is the Gandalf response. And while that may be absolutely ridiculous and pulling in a little bit of, a movie coming in, it was written in a book beforehand, which means that it automatically, in my mind, is going to be better. But they're the two basic responses that we have. We as believers can look at the way the world is going now and what's going to be happening in the future, and we can resign ourselves to it, or we can do what we're called to do and fight. Now, before I get too far through here, when we say fight and we talk about Christians, there's a few paradigms that we have to eliminate from our mindset. Because if your fight is to go grab your gun, then it is a non-biblical response that the church then would be putting forward. I'm not talking about fighting for one's country or even, defending because somebody is like trying to blow up your family or something like that. I'm talking with the very basic idea that as the church, we are told to fight. We're commanded to fight. You're actually ordered to. Believe it or not, when you became a Christian, you enlisted in the armed services. And it looks absolutely nothing like any military that exists in the world today or ever has. By the way, this is an armed service that scares the living bejeepers out of every single totalitarian regime that has ever existed on planet Earth. The Germanic tribes didn't scare the Romans. The Romans weren't even smart enough to get scared by the Scythian horsemen coming off of the steppes. They still tried to fight them. But they freaked out about the Church of Jesus Christ. You had emperor after emperor after emperor try to stamp it out. Think of the evil empire, the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union, right? Who did they oppose? The United States was nuclear weapons, and they tried to stamp out the church within its midst. The church in the Soviet Union didn't have guns. They didn't have high elected positions. Not that there were elections, you had to be a member of the Communist Party anyways. The church in China did the same thing. The church in China was isolated from the Western church by what they called the bamboo curtain. They cut off Western influence because one of the major reasons was to stop the influx of materials, namely Bibles especially, coming into the church in China. And they figured if they isolated the Chinese church from Western society, they could stamp it out. What happened when China began to have to reopen to Western civilizations is the church had multiplied like crazy, and the Chinese government had no response for it. Eventually they came up with a response. They actually started an official Chinese Christian church under state sponsorship to try to bring a lot of Christians within the fold of the government to see if they could regulate them more carefully. Some people did it. Many of them still stayed outside of it. And China today is in the midst of actually going back through one of the most severe clampdowns on Christianity that they've had in the last 30 years. They are blowing up church buildings. You can go through even official state-sponsored church buildings under the Chinese government. They are blowing up and taking down. You can go on YouTube or you can go on various other organizations and you can watch steeples fall. In response to this, the Chinese Christians that did not go underneath the state sponsorship enacted their plan to drop their meeting sizes down to 50. Has nothing to do with coronavirus. They have a plan to go down to 30 and even as small as 15. They're prepared to go cellular if necessary to avoid government detection. Do you know how much money the Chinese government is going to spend trying to track down Chinese Christians? Do you know what they do? They pray. They read their Bibles. And they tell other people about Jesus Christ. Some of you that are old, or like to study things that are old, might remember one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century. Tiananmen Square. Young man standing in front of a line of communist tanks. CNN's newsfeed got cut off. I dare you to think about what happened to that young man standing in front of that line of tanks. The Western media has no idea. CNN's feed got pulled. You understand that wasn't a Christian church uprising. That was something else. And they've meandered through that. Hong Kong being reintegrated, quote unquote, into China. They're meandering through that. They're still petrified of the church. But we don't fight like that. You can find tanks with a lot of different flags painted on the sides. But there's no such thing as a church tank. The church owns 0 guided missile cruisers. But that doesn't mean that we're left defenseless. Sometimes I think that because history unfolded the way that it did, we kind of take it for granted that the church is going to grow and become what it is. Do you know how many religions of the ancient world lie on the ash heap, never ever to be picked up again? Yet those of you that are used to flipping through your Bibles, how many times have you encountered going, oh, there it is, it's another church of Baal again. Oh, man. Yeah, you don't really. How about Zeus? You see any? I know it's a major problem nowadays. But it continues. Let's talk about what this looks like, because it will be unlike any other type of conflict you will ever encounter in your lives. So, I will be in Ephesians 6. So if you want to go there, you can get there before I do, and then that will be great for all of us. But you live every single day in a battleground. every single day. You don't need to leave your home to be in one. You don't even need to get out of your own bed to be in one. And it is absolutely terrifying if you're not prepared for it. So now that I've instilled the appropriate amount of misgiving, there's a really, really important reason that I want to make sure we understand this, because many of us will take it more seriously if there is a physical threat out there than a spiritual threat in here. We are so much creatures of time and space and of the physical that we tend to take things much more seriously that we can see. If you don't believe me, all you have to do is find something like a disease that is microscopic, that we can't really see like that, just to see how terrified people can become. I'm not trying to make light of it or, elevate one side or one idea or position over the other. But we like things the better we can see it, touch it, feel it, get a hold of it, and, quote, do something about it. When we don't feel like we have that, we feel like we've lost control. Folks, you live in a battle that you're never going to see and that you have absolutely zero control in and of yourself. So let's go to Ephesians chapter 6 and we'll get an idea here. Because beneath the physical world, there is the world of ideology. Right? Communism, capitalism, socialism. These are ideologies, patterns of thinking. Beneath ideologies lies the spiritual. Philosophy is going to come directly out of how people feel about the spiritual world. That's why they're so hard to tamp down and they're so hard to deal with. It's one of the reasons why governments will employ such force to control the religions and philosophies of the people. Because if they can do that, then they can take care of anything else pretty easily. That's why when communism would enter a nation, the first thing that they would promote was atheism. Because if the people in the heart of a human being, if they owed their allegiance to God first before the state, communism couldn't touch them because they owed a higher allegiance to something that the government couldn't touch. It terrified them. Because you know how hard it is to control people when the worst thing you can do to them, they go, okay, that's fine. I'd rather have Jesus than anything. You can't control people like that very well. And that's scary if control is what you want. So here's what Ephesians 6, I'm going to start in verse 10. It says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood." I'm going to stop right there. Because the first thing we need to recognize is that if, as a believer, if we try to fight this war in the physical realm, you've already lost. You already did, automatically. If all you want to do is oppose people, and you want to use violence to do it, you've already lost. Pack it in. I'm going to share something that's going to be really, really sad. It might seem like a really, really big downer. Do you want to know one of the basic responses to Christians to the threats of force that have existed over the last 2,000 years? You want to know what it is? We die. I'm serious. Talk to a believer that lives in Nigeria. It's sad. I'm not trying to be like, woohoo, isn't that great, guys? It is. How many Christians died in the Roman Colosseum? My question is, do you really want to know? I know I don't. It's not something that we're used to thinking like, oh, wow, I used to be happy. Thanks a lot. But again, I would ask you, if you sang that song, I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords to me, do we mean it when we sing it? Or do we really mean, I'd rather have Jesus than any of the nice, really silly trinkets, but there are some things over here, God, that are actually more important. Because if that's actually what we mean, then that tool is absent to us And that gives some other power tremendous sway over us. Can we sit there with somebody like Pastor Wormbrand coming out of Romania, founder of Voice of the Martyrs, and pray for those that are actively torturing him in prison? Being more concerned about the spiritual state of the person physically harming him than the own physical damage that's being done to his body. Shit, that's messed up. I agree. But that's what we're called to. Because he understood that the flesh and blood in front of him was not his enemy. And as long as we are willing to look at the flesh and blood around us as our enemies, we will be hamstrung to actually fight what's going on. So let's continue reading and we'll see what actually is going on. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. The enemies that we push against are spiritual. And to some extent, they're even internal, as we wrestle with those vestiges of who we were before Jesus Christ. I mean, if you want to ultimately culminate it in, you could find a leader in this in Satan. I mean, do you know what the term Satan means? So we have two common terms we use: the devil and Satan. Literally adversary and accuser. That's what they translate into. It's not a personal name. Just as the term God isn't a personal name, it's more of a title, so are both of those. So if you want to bring it to a pinnacle, he would stand at the top of that pinnacle, actively pushing a world philosophical system, a world ideological system, and even taking advantage of the fact that there is plenty of brokenness in our own hearts. And you can prick that too. Pushing against the Church of Jesus Christ. And if we're not sure if we have any brokenness left in us, let me tell you what, when somebody cuts you off at traffic, do you really have warm, pleasant feelings towards them? Somebody does something to you at work, knowing full well it's going to hurt you, you think, God bless them, everyone, right? We're just all Tiny Tim up in here, aren't we? Give me a break. Even if you can deal with it quickly, you're still ticked. I know we never ever express hate towards any person. Wish they were, and usually what we follow that with wasn't, I wish they were blessed. That's not how we're thinking usually, okay? That's not what it is. And I know every single one of us in here has done it, myself included. That's the reality of who we are. We're redeemed because of Jesus Christ, but folks, we are not perfect. And if we try to say, no, I've never hated anyone in my heart, then we just added lying on top of it, because I'm sure we have. That's the problem with us. That's why we need a Savior. That's the most common term, right? Savior. Why? Because it's not just all the gunk out there. The problem is that if I'm sitting alone in my closet, I brought my own worst enemy with me. And we know it's true. Let me give you another line of evidence just to make sure. How about a popular comedian? Oh, somebody like Robin Williams. Robin Williams is no longer with us, is he? Why?
He took his life.
Yeah. Robin Williams decided that there wasn't enough funny in the world, and he decided to take himself out of it. It's sad. Why? Because he could joke and he could make you laugh. The problem was he didn't have an answer for his own. That's why we need a Savior. It is absolutely crucial, it's absolutely essential, and it's also the basic term for enlistment. And it's a lifetime enlistment. You don't get out of it. So we struggle. So we never ever leave this battle. Here's the good news. You're called to stay in it, but you're not actually called to do most of the active fighting. And you certainly aren't responsible for providing everything that you need. Now, I'm not going to go through this. If those of you that are familiar with it, you're going, oh, it's Ephesians chapter 6. Oh, he's starting in verse 10. Oh, we're going into the armor of God. It's there. I'm not going to go through every single piece, at least not right now. There's a few basic provisions, though, because usually when people hit this section, they start going through and they talk about each individual piece, and there's great value in that. But there's some ideas around this that we really need to make sure that we keep here. So I'm going to finish reading because I never ever finish doing anything. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Verse 14, stand therefore. The first thing we need to understand is we're called actually to literally stand. Now, it does not say stand around. Okay, I want to make sure that I distinguish that. So let's go back through, because a lot of our ideas when we go through this passage have been very, very influenced by the medieval era and even the commentaries of somebody like Matthew Henry. Great commentaries, but one of the things we remember is that the Apostle Paul never, ever, ever lived in 12th century England. He lived under the Roman Empire. Everything about how he thought about what conflict looked like was dominated by this kind of Roman idea. So the first thing we have to understand is that in ancient warfare, you won if you held the battlefield at the end. It wasn't measured by casualties. It wasn't measured by a lot of the things that maybe we would consider today. You won if you were the one standing on the battlefield and the other dude wasn't. In fact, if you want to really get simple about it, yes, a lot of people died in ancient warfare. I'm not trying to say they didn't. But the bottom line is ancient warfare was a lot like two bulldozers going at it. And you shoved them off literally. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit when we get into the armor, but there's two implements in the armor that would help you with this. The first thing is, in fact, I almost brought a pair. The Roman sandal had cob nails shoved into the base of it. It would be kind of like wearing either running spikes or like football cleats. Okay? Traction. Because you're not going to be able to stand if you don't have traction. Now, you put me out on grass in my fancy smancy sandals here, and I'm not going to be all that hard to shove off. Go ahead and give me a pair of football cleats and see if that makes a difference. That's number one. Number two was both the arrangement of the Roman army and their shield. Because what they would do is they would take their shield, and the Romans were close quarter fighters. Because if you're going to shove the other guy off the battlefield, you better get close. So they would advance, and what they would seek to do is engage their shield with the shield of their enemy. And what they would do is the line coming up behind them would take their shield and put it right in the center of their back. And they would crouch, and they would push. So literally, the person in the front line was not just pushing himself, he was literally being shoved by the rest of the formation behind him. Which meant that even as the enemy was trying to hack down the soldiers in the front, they were still moving backwards doing it. What happens when you're being pushed backwards against your will? What part of your foot do you end up on? You're on your heels. Which means, what's the next step after heels? You're a lot easier to beat then. Remember, they have cob nails in their shoes too. You get the idea here. He says, stand. Do not move backwards. People go, oh, that's because the armor didn't have a backplate on it. It has nothing to do with having no back armor. It has everything to do with the fact that you can only fight facing forward. He says, stand. Do not move. You all here, I myself, have things that we can do to stand. It's Father's Day. Say, Father's Day supposed to do that. Yay, dads. You ready, dads? Stand. That means your family. You stand and you do not back down. It's yours. In ancient warfare, what did you want? You wanted high ground. Your home is your high ground. This church is your high ground. Whatever organizations you participate in, that is your high ground. You are commanded to stand. You don't retire. You don't pack it in for the night. You're done fighting when the battle's off. And now believe me when you say, man, this sounds like a perpetual pain in the neck. God gives us plenty of time and peace, rest, and time to recoup. God's not dumb. God's not ignorant. He knows what he's doing. He knows that you can't live in perpetual hysteria all the time. He gives us plenty of time for rest and recuperation. But when it's time to stand, we stand. You're equipped to stand. You have everything you need. Now, the next part of it, if we keep on going here, as we get into the shield, is, the Roman soldier tends to be like elevated, like, oh, wow, they're great, right? Because like the Romans like defeated a whole bunch of people. They were one of the finest war machines the world has seen. The individual Roman soldier was not all that impressive. If you wanted like an impressive one-on-one Roman warrior, you'd have to get a gladiator. Yeah, they were pretty able. Individual Roman soldiers, not all that spectacular. Roman soldiers, though, were incredibly well disciplined, and they fought as a unit. Now, the Roman military unit was something called the maniple. It was an improvement on everything else because they had to be able to maneuver around the rugged Italian countryside. And here is the basic Roman military doctrine. Fight together, never break formation. Because the shield was meant to be able to help push, but they're also made, not to literally, quote, clamp or lock together, but they're made to push together to form a solid wall of shields. Their shield would be a little over 2 feet across, and would be around 4 feet high. So if they needed to, they could put their shield down and crouch, and it would cover their body. But that's not how they fought. When they fought, because of the arm that your shield is on, when you put it down, it covered not just you, but it actually covered the other shoulder of the person standing next to you. One gap not just exposed a line, it actually exposed the edge of another soldier that was depending on you to be where you're supposed to be. Because, you see, a Roman soldier all by himself was likely a deceased Roman soldier. They weren't that great by themselves. There are plenty of accounts of Roman soldiers becoming isolated in tiny groups where they couldn't use their formation, and they were beaten. Why did they win so often? They won because they stuck together at all costs. There are accounts of Roman soldiers coming through horrific situations that the leaders never should have led them into. They should have been, by all accounts, annihilated, and sometimes they were. But there were times where Roman soldiers literally fought themselves out of horrific ambushes. A little bighorn experience, like where the 7th Cavalry didn't emerge at all. They emerged, at least some would emerge from some of those. Why? Because they literally would make a ball of shields, and they moved. They called it the tortoise. If you tried to lob arrows overhead, they put shields down, they put shields overhead. And they would creep, and they didn't care how slow they moved. They stayed together. Folks, if you want to fight, you better not do it by yourself. You weren't made for that. The equipment God gave you wasn't made for you to go solo hero gladiator soldier. God's not looking for gladiators. He doesn't need gladiators. Because remember, you without this armor are helpless. Who gave you the armor? If God gave you the armor, He doesn't need you to do all the heavy lifting fighting. He wants you to do what He's told you to do. No matter what's happened? Yeah, no matter what's happened. He said stand. He said, I gave you this shield. You keep the shield in proper position, what's going to get through? Nothing. But that means you have to remember to bring it with you. And that means that you better keep it in the right place. And that means whatever you do, don't move it. Because you don't just expose yourself to danger, you expose those next to you to danger as well. This is not meant to be a solo exercise. That's why this is so important. That's why when we were told, okay, you can't meet publicly together, that's what we said, then we better find a format online to meet. To be able to, to share the word, in a forum such as this, but also to be able to communicate together. That's one of the reasons why the text messaging happened. That's why we had the chat apps and stuff like that to be able to communicate like that. Because if we were trying to do it alone, we would not make it. You're not designed for that. Don't try. God didn't give you the equipment to do that. Don't try. Now, as I go down through, I am going to skip a few verses here. I'm going to go down to verse 18. It says, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance, in the supplication for all the saints, and for me, that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. the last part of this. You see, when we go through the armor, most of the time we stop with the shield of faith, and we talk about the sword of the Spirit, and then we're done. And we never make it to this section, but it's absolutely necessary. We leave out the part where prayer comes into play. Now, I've looked at a few different things about how to characterize this or something like that. We have the armor, and that's great. But if Napoleon Bonaparte taught us anything, he taught us that an army marches on its stomach. If you can't keep it supplied, it doesn't matter how good they are, eventually they'll fold. Right? Doesn't matter. If you can keep the best personnel with the best equipment isolated long enough, they're done. How do you stay supplied? That's where the prayer comes in. This prayer is urged to keep us in contact with God and to ask God and to plead with Him. That's what that whole idea of supplication is. It's not like, dear God, help so-and-so. This is like tears and sweat supplication prayer, not just for ourselves, but for others. That God will give them the necessary strength to keep moving, to push against whatever it is. Because this isn't a physical thing. It is a spiritual battle that we are in. And here's the great news. God never loses. He never drops people in isolated. There are plenty of accounts in warfare of soldiers becoming cut off and becoming isolated. God never leaves you that way. In the physical realm, the very worst thing that can happen to you physically means that you go to be with Him immediately. I know it's not like a really, really popular thing, but believe me, the church overseas clings to that hope and they understand it. They have to. Because we can live in relative physical safety here. That's not the case for everybody. And you know what? They still push. Now, at a certain point, you can age out of any military on the planet. You never age out of this one. I know a lot of times when we're talking about, fighting in conflict, right? You're looking for big, impressive people. We have an idea of what a soldier is supposed to look like, don't we? Somebody that's 95 years old that gets around really, really slowly in their house, probably not your ideal of a soldier, is it? But in the spiritual realm, it really doesn't matter. I wonder if we saw with spiritual eyes who the real warriors would look like and who people that might impress us otherwise, maybe they don't amount to a whole lot. Now, I'm going to go a little bit, I'm going to give you, kind of my own perspective, but with the emphasis that I see on prayer, if you think about it, think how many verses are dedicated at the end of this passage towards prayer. 3 of them, basically. More than any other single topic. I would posit from this that if you want to scare the living bejeepers out of the devil, all you need are several people that are absolutely dedicated to prayer. I don't think he wants anything to do with it. Remember I said that communication? Modern conflict has become really, really centralized on air power. What you can bring in from the sky. What happens to the person that calls in air support? Weapons beyond their immediate capability. I'm not sure that it's necessarily the best analogy, but you have several people that are absolutely dedicated to prayer. They're not bringing their resources to bear. They're bringing their Heavenly Father's resources to bear. Now, I'm going to tell you what. If Satan doesn't want to tangle with anything, he wants nothing to do with the resources God can bring to bear. Nothing to do. That's why if we go to other places like in James, it says, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee. Why? Because he knows who's coming. And it's not us that does this. It's God who does it. That's why we can stay in hope in every single situation. Because we're not depending on our own resources, we're not depending on our own abilities. We are resting in the security that God can work and take advantage and do good in any situation, and that He is powerful enough to accomplish His purposes. It doesn't matter if it seems like it's the end of the world, because the world doesn't end until He says so. It's not going to throw Him off. Earlier I referenced China. So the last of the Western missionaries that left China, many of them left through Hong Kong. In fact, a number of them stayed in Hong Kong. When China was beginning to reopen and some of them used their contacts to try to slip back into China just to see what was left, the speculation of what was happening in China was kind of all over the place. Most of them expected that the church would be virtually non-existent. What they found when they made it in there blew the most optimistic estimates completely out of the water. Because no matter how difficult the situation that they faced, the strength that God gave those Christians in China carried them through. Not because of who they were, but because of who God is. We can debate communism, capitalism, we can debate Soviet Union versus USA, we can debate all these things that we want. But here's the one that I want you to put your money on. Put the church against any regime in the world. Today the big one maybe is North Korea. I will tell you right now, North Korea will not eradicate the church. They just won't. Because it's not under their authority to do so. We can actively engage in prayer for them. Because here's what we know. No matter how difficult it gets, no matter how many literal holes in the ground that they need to meet in, they will emerge victorious. I'm not saying that they're going to change the entire government of North Korea. That's not their objective. They will continue to move forward. They will continue to share the gospel. Defectors from North Korea continue to tell us that even in fearful fits and starts, believers in North Korea are still continuing to share now SD cards with Bibles on them. They're continuing to distribute very, very carefully Christian literature. They are continuing to witness. In what's considered the most hostile place on earth for Christianity, the church is still moving. Shields locked, feet set to stand, and they are praying. So there's the challenge for us, isn't it? Can we? Because the great thing is, victory is assured. As one Bible commentator put it, as Christians, we don't fight for victory. We fight from a position of victory. That's the reality of what we're engaged in. We automatically know what we're fighting for, and that victory is coming. And again, let me make it very, very clear. This is in no way, any sense, some sort of physical conflict. This is not a call to spread the gospel by the sword. It will not accomplish what you're hoping if we try. It is a call to spread what God has given to us through the means He has given to us. That's what we have. The devil is terrified of it, but it is hope to those that are perishing. It's a message people desperately need, because you don't need to look very hard to find evidence that there is pain, hurt, and brokenness in the world that we live in. How many times do we look around and wonder, is the place coming apart? Is everybody going crazy? Is the thing going to spin out of control? What do people want? People want some sort of hope. They want something to be able to grab onto. This shares all of the hope we can actually center on, but it's not going to be hope in the physical world. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Just thank you for the goodness that you have given to us. Thank you for your word and its instruction. But thank you for its encouragement. We're called, for us, we look at it and it would be something difficult. But at the same time, Father, we stand not according to our strength, but your strength. Just give us the courage to stand where we need to stand. And we pray in Christ's name. Amen.